All right. Thank you, Jesse. I will share my screen. All right. As Jesse said, I'm Dr. Matthew Kilpatrick, and I'll be talking about machine learning for anomaly detection in neutron scattering experiments. So we are collaborating with Oak Ridge National Lab, specifically the TOPAZ single crystal diffractometer, which is located on the spallation neutron source. I will point you to a previous webinar that I actually did on this topic. There's the YouTube link above, but it's also on the RadiaSoft YouTube channel. But I will give some quick background on the actual experiment. So this detector is a high precision volumetric sampling detector, which can measure the reciprocal space of scattered neutrons. And so as the neutrons are traveling down this beamline here on the right, it will hit a sample that is located within the center of this detector. And you could see these boxes that are going to be able to measure the scattered neutron intensities. And you can see it doesn't have full 4 pi steradian coverage, so we do have a bit of missing information, but it has quite a bit of information that we can use for physics analyses. And then the great thing about this detector, well, since you can't move the detectors around, you can actually, the sample in the center, you could rotate it around, you can move it to different orientations to get different measurements for your particular crystal. There's also a fair bit of temperature control. You can have heat it up to about 450 Kelvin. You can measure it at room temperature, which is about 300 Kelvin, and you can cool it down to about 5 Kelvin. And this does cover a broad range of what is called Q coverage, but also Q is equivalent to momentum. So a large amount of momentum measurements. And so a quick bit of background of what is actually happening. So why do we actually shoot these particles at things? We typically could do an X-ray scattering, which is really good at probing low Z materials, so low numbers of for the atomic nuclei. But we're working with materials that we want to see really dynamic effects, and this is good with neutrons because they are weakly scattered. And so a neutron that is coming down as an incident beam will have can either pass straight through most materials or only have a single scattering. And so this weak scattering will give us a really good probe of the minute interactions or the minute structure of a crystal. And so what we're actually measuring is we're measuring the scattered momentum of the neutron here. And since we know the instant beam momentum, we're able to calculate the change in momentum, which is going to be this Q momentum measurement for our actual space. And so I'll be talking about this. It's usually called reciprocal space. It could be some other fields might call it Q space or reciprocal space, momentum space. I might interchangeably throw these around. But it's really good and beneficial if you have a material near absolute zero to measure these particles with. And so how do we actually get our particles near absolute zero? So this is a diagram of how the crystal would be mounted within the detector. And so you have a holder that you can mount a sample on the very end. And then you have these 2 aluminum cylinders that are going to be installed over the sample and are going to be used to fill in liquid coolant to be able to get the sample down to this 5 Kelvin range. And so as we have these neutrons bombarding the sample, it's going to go through the aluminum cylinders, ideally interact with the sample. But as with everything, it could interact with the aluminum cylinder instead. So this is some background that is not going to be good for our physical interpretation, and we want to ideally remove it from our analysis entirely. So how does this actually work is you have an instant beam, and your aluminum cylinder, while it's not a single crystal lattice, it's going to have a isometric distribution of different lattice planes that are going to be in different orientations. As you can see by this diagram here, if you have a large number of lattices in different orientations, you can get different scattering cones. And these are going to constructively and deconstructively interact to produce what are called Debye-Shearer rings. And so this is a 2-dimensional aspect. And so if you were to measure just a direct 2D plane, you would get a doublet of ring structures, and then there would be multiple going outwards. But this detector is a three-dimensional measurement device. And so if you were to translate this 2D ring structure onto a three-dimensional space, you would end up having a sphere. And so how do we actually look at this data? What are we actually going to see represented? First, we are doing everything in a Jupyter Hub interface. So let's say I'm working on a computer here and I'm editing code and visualizing within Jupyter Hub. We have a Docker installation that is utilizing an NVIDIA GPU. And then on this NVIDIA GPU, we have collaborators that we're working with at NVIDIA. We're using Index, which I will describe in a second. But this is a great 3D visualization environment that we can really look at all our data in a very quick aspect. And then along the same lines, we have a Jupyter Hub Python installation where we can start doing physics analyses and start developing machine learning methods to identify our sample and remove this anomalous background. So Index, NVIDIA's Index is a browser-based 3D visualization framework. Here are a couple screenshots of samples here. You can take a sample, you can rotate it around, you can pan, you can zoom in and out, and you can view these really large three-dimensional volumes. This grid here is 1,000 cubed voxel environment, and you can still rotate it around very quickly. And you can stream video, such as if you were to be at the beamline at TOPAZ, you can stream in neutrons in a continuous manner and view this live at the detector. And so what we do is we take a TOPAZ event data, which is really a list of measurements in momentum space, and we can convert this to a voxel format, which is going to be a regular three-dimensional grid. And then each point in this space is going to be colored or made transparent by the neutron intensity, or a scientist could just give it a different label, such as just a constant or some other aspect that they are trying to edit. And then they can use this color map here, which is something I'll show you interactively in a second, to dynamically edit these particles, or dynamically turn on and off these voxels. And so there's quite a bit of information there. If you have a 1,000 cubed grid, that's 1 billion pixels. That's quite a bit of information. But the nice thing about this is that most of them are actually zero most of the time. So we can represent this as a sparse data set, which allows us to be much more efficient in our data representation. And it's also quite independent of Wi-Fi quality, so you can still get really good interactions even on a poor network interface. And so you can see, while editing this color map here, you can get other interesting features out of the detector. So why don't we go take a look at that real quick? I'm going to spin up the neutrons here. Oh, let's bring that back. Can't really see this, it's in the way. Okay. So here I have Index running on Jupyter Hub, that nice interface. And so we can see, if I just make this a bit bigger, I have a sample that I've loaded into Index, and I can rotate this around in a nice aspect. But you see, all the colors are all the same, and I'm not really sure what features I'm trying to look at here. So I can go to the color map and dynamically adjust what I'm viewing. And so we can just remove quite a bit. Since we're going to concentrate on these aluminum rings, we know that they're going to be at a very finite intensity. And for these scatter neutrons, it's actually quite a low value. So we're going to look at a really small intensity values for most of these. So I know I can actually just remove most of the high intensity data without changing it all that much. And then I can start slowly scanning through this color map and removing features. And you can see, as I'm dynamically changing this, we see these ring structures. And I must note that with the detector format of this space, it is just a coarse measurement of these rings. But if you imagine it a full 4 pi steradian measurement, you would get a sphere in this aspect. And so we can see this sphere structure. I can zoom in and out, and I can see this anomalous structure that is not going to always be present in the sample. It's only going to be present when we have the aluminum cylinders for the cooling of the sample. And so what we would ideally like to do is have a machine learning method to identify these and then dynamically remove them from the sample in real time during streaming of an event. And so how are we going to actually do that? I'm just going to quickly go back to the slides and I'll start the slideshow again. So how are we going to identify these aluminum rings? Well, we first need to start building a neural network. And the the method that we started to work with is developing a three-dimensional convolutional neural network to train and predict on our samples. We're using a UNet structure, which is a structure mainly used for image segmentation. The nice thing about this is that it's fully connected. It has a contraction path where you're moving from your initial large dimensional space down to some small feature space that is going to ideally have some physical interpretation of your sample. And then you have an expansion path where you use your fully connected information to expand it back out, but ideally it's going to be a prediction of this model. And so what we need to do is we scan through all of our samples that have these aluminum rings, and we use a clustering algorithm to first identify them to give us a truth mask, and we can use this as a training and labeling information for our data set. And the great thing about this three-dimensional UNet is that it's very good at working with the sparse annotations of a large, dense, volumetric manner. So since we can take our three-dimensional TOPAZ data and represent it in that sparse information, there's a really good analog of working with these two structures. So ideally, what we would have is, this is an example sample. You can see the slight rings here. And as we were to take this and evaluate it through our network, we would end up with a prediction of the rings at the very end. And so you could see there's a bit of match up here, like if there's a ring segment here, we can match it here. And so we get a fairly good prediction of rings in this example environment. This is the ideal scenario, but there is unfortunately some data management involved. So I mentioned that we're working with an 1,000 cubed grid of neutron intensities. That is quite a bit of data. It turns out if you were to create a three-dimensional network with this, you would run out of GPU memory almost immediately. So we need to do some data management. And initially, since we know that the aluminum rings are going to be concentrated near the center of this three-dimensional space, we can actually cut out a small bit of the grid to work with. We don't need to work with the entire sample space in this scenario. So I initially cut out a 500 cubed space to work with, but it turns out that is still additionally too much. And so along those same lines, we take that grid and then split it into a 5 by 5 by 5 cube that are all going to be equal sizes of 100 cubed. Now, this is this formatting will give us from one sample 125 varying samples that are going to have different labels that we can then feed through our model and evaluate, train, and predict on. This, however, is a size that can be optimized. It doesn't have to be 100. You can make it 50. You can make it 250. Just really some sort of way to split up the data set into a more manageable aspect. And so how do we actually do this? So I'm now going to go back to Jupyter Hub and the models of what we're actually analyzing. So this is, I can't actually see these things. Okay. So here I am going to work with a method where I've defined my models. I've actually already run some of these because it does take a little bit to load this data and to format it correctly. But the main thing is to note the data sizes here. So after taking in all my samples that I've constructed in a correct format, I can then do this splitting that I was previously talking about. And we see the 100 by 100 by 100 shape. And then I have over 1,600 different samples to train and evaluate my neural network on. And so this is the three-dimensional UNet architecture that I've developed to try to identify these aluminum rings. We can see the 100 cubed input, And then we have the first layer and down only one contraction path, actually. And then we're going to expand it up to a single layer. So it's really just a very small U shape that's going to give us a prediction of what our aluminum sample is. And so we can evaluate that to make sure we get a nice definition of the model. You can see the 100 cubed here. We're going to have various convolutions and dropouts and max poolings, but this is all to keep the feature space and fully connected aspect of the model consistent with the UNet architecture. And you could see here this total parameters, the 296. If I was to expand this to say, instead of having a 100 cubed sample size, maybe I had 250, these parameters really increase exponentially. And so you could start filling up your GPU quite quickly with this. So the data management comes in an important role if you're going to train on a single GPU for this aspect. And so we have a model fitting parameter. While this loads our data, I'll just say that I'm using some default parameters here. We're shuffling our data around, and then just for ease of execution, I'm only running over 10 epochs of training. But you could see we get some nice loss and validation curves, and it actually gets to the end pretty quickly. And so once we have a fully trained model, so 10 epochs is not actually a large amount. Typically, you would go for a much longer training aspect. I will run my models mainly to 1,000 epochs of training, and then you can save your data as a, oh yes, I changed the class structure. And so you can take your model output, save the structure of the model and the weights of your connected neurons, and you can save that as an HDF5 file for further evaluation. So once we have a model that is fully constructed, it's been trained, and we have a really good accuracy in reconstruction, well, how do we actually take a sample and predict on it and check whether or not we have a good prediction of these aluminum rings? And so I have another script here. You can see that I'm going to work with exactly one sample. And so this is our original 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000 grid. And I've already split it up into this, cutting out the 500 cubed space and then splitting that into a smaller 100 cube aspect. And we see that we have our 125 cubes in this grid. This is the exact same model as before, and I can define that. You get the exact same connections, and again, 296 parameters. And then what we need to do is to make sure, as we defined our model, we load in the weights of the parameter of the model that we've determined as the best one, and then to evaluate our prediction on. And so the great thing about machine learning is that it's actually quite quick. You can do this in real time in a very quick aspect, and so you can get a prediction within just a couple of seconds. I have this very large grid with a lot of parameters, and I can get a prediction in just 4.5 seconds. And then I have a method to take all my different 125 cubes, and then I can recombine them together to get the initial 500 cubed grid. And so I now want to see, well, how well did this do? And so the main thing about this convolutional network is that for each individual voxel that is going to be input into the network, it will predict a number for me. And so for each input, I'm going to get a numerical value of what the network gives is a probability of whether or not it's in this ring structure. And so if it gives me a number of 0, which is most of them here, it's giving me a very confident likelihood that it's not an aluminum ring. And then on the other aspect, here, this maximum, it's only about 0.1, it's going to give me a likelihood that it is an aluminum ring. And so the scientist or a researcher would start to develop methods where what along this range would I say is going to be an aluminum ring? And just for the ease of analysis, I'm going to say that anything greater than 0.05 is an aluminum ring. And so as I take a sample and I evaluate it, I get this number of each voxel, and then I just say, hey, anything greater than this, that's going to be my answer. So now that we've done all our formatting and aspects, let's actually first compare it to the labels. And so here I'm going to print out what we're actually wanting. This is the golden representation of these samples. And so you can see it does look like a ring structure. If I zoom in, I have these doublets here, and then I have pairs of doublets moving outward in radius. And so ideally, my prediction of the CNN would look almost exactly the same. And so if I change this to a true very quickly, and so I'm now going to show what the neural network says is a ring. And so as I wait a few seconds for this to show, okay, you can see this is the actual prediction, and it looks quite similar. You get the same doublet structure, you get rings moving outward, you get a very nice confirmation that it looks like we're identifying aluminum rings pretty well. So now that we have a prediction of this, this is something that we don't actually want. So we can invert our estimation and then just remove this from a sample, and we can take this representation and add it to our regular data set, or really subtract it from our regular data set, and then save this in a format that, again, Index would be able to view. And so if we take this and go back to Index for visualization, we can view this. So if I load the sample that we've just saved, it is going to look surprisingly different. Okay, so here's the sample that we just saved. I have taken every single valid point and given it a value of 10. But I've also taken the points, all of the points that are in aluminum rings, and I've given those a value of 1. And so if I zoom out, I first see that, well, there's a lot of information here. And since I've given these two different values, I know that if I cut out a large majority of the middle, nothing happens, or nothing should happen. And then let's give it some transparency. Then, okay, as we dynamically adjust this, I should slowly see these rings interplaying. All right. Okay, as we slowly interact with this. Okay, these rings should, okay, as you can see, this is my sample, and these are the rings that I previously identified here. And so it's great that we can see them within the sample, but then what we ideally want to do is just remove them entirely. And you can do this dynamically in Index. As if I just cut that out, it'll just remove it'll remove these rings entirely. I have a nice blank space here, and I can bring them back quickly just to see them. So you can see, all right, with the transparency, I can see these rings. I see the nice doublets, but then it's great to have the interactability to see the rings disappear in real time. And it's removing this anomalous aluminum ring background that is just due to the configuration of the detector that's going to be showing these rings from the scattered aluminum in the detector setup. And so I'll just finish with saying thank you all to our partners at Oak Ridge National Lab, our partners at NVIDIA for using Index, and my collaborators at RadiaSoft and the DOE for funding this research. So, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. That was a great presentation. If anyone has further questions, be sure to put them in the Q&A at the bottom, and we'll just jump right into the Q&A part. First question is, why do you use 3D unit as opposed to 2D unit architecture?
Right. So I'll go back to this slide here. I am still sharing. Okay, the 3D unit, okay, it's very good at working with this large volumetric segmentation. I started initially with the 3D because the aluminum rings are an inherent three-dimensional structure. And so I wanted to learn the actual shape and structure of what these rings are, but we do have methods to integrate the same 2D unit structure and feed in the data likewise. So what we plan on doing further research is comparing the prediction and training results of both networks to see which one ends up being better.
Great, thank you. Next question is, how is index being applied to physical analysis at TOPAZ?
Yeah, thank you. So index is really good. You can look at a full data set on the TOPAZ experiment. We've actually installed this on on some GPUs servers at the TOPAZ experiment, and its actually use case right now is to be able to visualize live streaming neutron events as they're taking data, and a scientist in real time can see data accumulating for a sample that they're working with. And we have abilities to analyze these processes. You could execute this model, or you could run analysis algorithms to tell you some information about your sample. And so a scientist would be able to make real-time decisions on a test that they're running for some crystalline sample that they've worked with.
Great,
Yeah.
thanks. That brings us right up to the end of our time here for today. I just want to remind everyone that they're more than welcome to join our Slack conversations about SREPO. I just put that into the chat. You can join and submit any further questions or get other kinds of support from that platform as well. So thanks again to Dr. Matt Kilpatrick for a great presentation, and we hope to see you guys in our next webinar. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
Bye, everyone.